Welcome to Writers Talk, the podcast where writers talk about writing. Today on the podcast, we have Anthony Ellis back with us, and we'll be talking to him about creativity and imagination and why these are two different and necessary things for every writer, creative writer or business writer, to have in their repertoire for success. Welcome, Anthony. How are you?
Thanks, Chris. No, I'm good. And yourself?
I'm fine.
It's been a while since we spoke, but it's good to be back on the podcast.
And you're always welcome back. So,
thank you.
So today we're talking about a couple of articles that are live on the site. One of them is called "What is Imagination and Why It's Important for Fiction Writing?" And that one has to make sure I'm not yet. That one is the one you wrote. And we're also talking about 5 steps to creativity in writing, which is about creativity, as it says.
Yes.
And Amanda wrote that one.
Yes. Yeah. It's a good topic to discuss today. Actually, earlier today I was doing all sorts of admin and trying to get some documents ready for a tax submission, which, as you can imagine, is the least creative or imaginative task.
Yeah.
So, when you say that imagination is important for writers, I think it's important for all of us just to escape the reality of life sometimes.
Just for your sanity, yes, yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, much less creativity. But I suppose writers use their imagination and their creativity, much like any artist, a little bit more than other people, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one assumes that's true. Do you think that there are other fields besides the art fields that tend to use the imagination as much as like writers or artists do?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, besides the obvious ones like filmmakers and poets and songwriters, I think each of us in our day-to-day life use imagination, whether it's the way we decorate our living spaces or the way we create a new dish when we're in the kitchen, or even just the way we entertain ourselves as we make a commute to work, or I think we do use our imagination a lot.
And I was sort of thinking about it.
I'm sure mathematicians or statisticians and that also, but I can't speak for them, but I imagine that they also have creative ways. I mean, I think Einstein is probably one of the most creative people out there.
I mean, for anyone who has to think about something and hypothesize a new thing must be creative, and they must just always be in a sort of creative mode. And I mean, I think it goes to people who create physical things and
yes.
all that stuff. I think perhaps, if your job is just replicating something or, just stamping out license plates or something, you might not be in that sort of creative space. But there's probably a huge amount of activity that is creative that you don't necessarily think of as a creative process.
Yeah. And I imagine that's the same for everyone, is that we don't always think that what we're doing is creative or that it is using our imagination. But I guess as you were saying that, I was thinking, creativity and imagination are probably used in two ways. And one is to escape reality or to create something that's entertainment or something that's beautiful. But there's another part of it that's about solving problems, So I don't know about you, but if I have to do something that I don't really like doing, like a mundane task like tax or folding laundries, I'll always try and find a clever way to do it quicker. That is if I can't get somebody else to do it for me.
I won't do it more quickly. I'll just find something to do at the same time as it. So I'll listen to something.
Exactly.
Or
try
and listen to like an audiobook or something like that while I do it.
Something to make it a little bit more bearable. Now that you mentioned that, when I was doing some research into, especially the imagination blog, it was
I
a
just
story that
sorry to interrupt.
Mm,
Before we
no,
dive
sure.
into that, I just
Yeah.
maybe we should just talk about the difference
Start at the beginning.
between creativity and imagination.
Yeah. No,
Just to
absolutely.
give us a basis of what we're going off. So,
Yeah. No, and I think,
what
yeah,
for you? What is the difference? Because a lot of people, I think, see them as a similar or related thing.
yeah. And I think they absolutely are similar and in many ways very much related. Um, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that they're both, human qualities that we can't live without. They really are instinctive human functions. I suppose imagination is more, something that you make up, or how you come up with new ideas or concepts, in your mind, whether that's from something you've heard before or seen before. So if you like, you can maybe even think of it as like daydreaming. Um,
Sure,
so
why not?
I suppose it's a very sort of instinctive, automatic, kind of human function or brain function, if you want to call it that. Um, Whereas creativity is more about how you use, how you solve problems or how you come up with new concepts, not necessarily from a blank slate, but from other, things that you've heard and seen before. So a great example, maybe to explain the difference, or not even explain the difference, or just to illustrate how maybe the two work together. So there was and I can't remember his name now. Yeah, the man who invented the taser. That
Right.
was an American. Um, he, as a child, he grew up reading a lot of stories, and one of them was a story about the frontier time, I think it was, and the hero of these children's book had an electric gun, so it wouldn't kill people, but it would, stun them. And obviously, he grew up and he became an engineer. And then one day he was reading in the paper, there was a lot of protests going on in America. I think it was due to the Vietnam War, and they were looking for a way to, to control crowds and maintain riots and that sort of thing. And then suddenly, his engineering background, um, that story that he remembered from his childhood, um, and this need for crowd control sort of solidified, and that's how he came up with the idea of the taser.
I
So
suppose what I really like about that story, Anthony, is that it's a work of fiction that then went on to sort of
yes,
inspire a real creation in a real life thing
yes. So
that
obviously, as a
prevented
child,
people from being killed. So
yeah,
that's a really good story, I suppose.
yeah. So as a child, obviously, his imagination was stirred by this story, and it lived inside his mind, and it illuminated inside his mind, and it stayed with him because it's so memorable. And I think very often those things you see as a child, and when you imagine, when you're very ripe and you take on and you believe a lot more of what's imaginative, those things are very powerful to help your creativity later on. But obviously, when he designed the gun, the taser, he was using, serious skills that he'd learned as an engineer or as a physicist, um, and was working towards an absolute solution. So it's very much in the same way. As a writer, you may daydream and you might remember things from your childhood or from your past, or things that you'd seen in other stories. But once you sit down to write that book, that's when your creativity and your skills need to come into play, I guess. So I think that's a clumsy way of me trying to illustrate how the two work together and how they're slightly different.
Maybe I can
Um,
try for a more concrete
yes.
approach. So the way I see imagination, just imagination, is that the sum of the knowledge that you have acquired up until this point in your life is what you can imagine. You can take any of the things you've learned throughout your life and then
Yeah.
use your imagination to imagine new things with them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this person took this book he had read with his engineering degree, and he, imagined this fictional weapon into reality, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is why it's so important for writers to be well read and just knowledgeable about things.
Oh yeah, you need a deep well to draw, to draw from.
I mean, you can certainly tell with certain writers that this is a person who knows everything seemingly, right? You get that impression with um, just some of the more impressive writers that
Mm-hmm.
they could go on about almost any subject, ad nauseum. But they've chosen like the best parts of it to create this work of imagination. And
Yeah.
then sorry.
No. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And yeah, so that's how I see imagination. It's just taking this bit of this thing, another part of this thing, some of this flavoring of that, and your brain works at it for a while, and it produces a lightsaber, right?
Yeah.
Take some Kurosawa films, take some Buck Rogers, and suddenly George
Yeah.
Lucas has Jedi, right? That's the
Yeah.
imagination,
Absolutely.
and the
Yeah.
creativity is the thing that you end up with, right?
Yeah.
Creativity is taking imagination, the ingredients, and
Yeah.
applying a recipe to it, and producing your creative cake at the end of it, be it your book, your script, your taser, or whatever.
Yeah. I
Does
actually
that
think
make
that's quite a
sense?
cool way to describe it. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So imagination is the ingredient, and sometimes that doesn't have to go anywhere necessarily. So you could just simply be imagining, oh, like I wish I was on a beach in the Maldives right now, or
So the way I like to think about that is, you always have the best ideas when you're on the treadmill or you're in the shower, right?
yes, yeah,
When you can't take them down. That's your imagination. It almost never becomes a product, unfortunately.
yeah, that's true.
But
But
sometimes you're in front of a keyboard when that's going on, and you can get something really good out of it, and that's the
or you,
creativity part of it.
yeah. So there's two things there. So the one is, just to go back to what you said about the lightsabers and George Lucas, and I think that's something that we don't often recognize as writers and as creatives, is that we inherit all of this bounty from the generations that come before us. So each we have this whole rich pool to tap from, and we always owe those people who came before us for either breaking new ground or giving us such good starting points. So I think that's one thing that, as you said, that I realized, we actually do owe a huge debt to everyone who comes before us as a writer.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
just to be grateful to anyone who's ever written something down,
yeah,
and then passed it on.
absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
it's an amazing thing. I mean, it is what drives civilization forward, and
yeah,
and it's why we can have cool things like iPhones and
yeah,
be able
and
to
I
talk
mean,
over Zoom.
yeah,
So just be appreciative of the information that is
absolutely.
stored in books and
Yeah,
computers.
yeah, not
But
even just in writing. Yeah, it's in any way we move forward.
yes,
Um, yeah, and then there was a second thing now, which I've completely forgotten. Yeah,
but
but
right.
it'll come back
So
to me.
so the audience, our writing audience, is now sort of
Mm,
wondering, okay, my imagination, that's great, creativity, that's great, but how does it apply to me writing a book?
mm.
How do I turn this into a script, right?
Or yeah, into a narrative, into something that makes sense and something that's recognizable. Yeah, and I suppose I actually did remember what I wanted to tell you, and it actually
Okay,
fits in
yeah, please.
very nicely here. Is we can have a million daydreams and we can imagine 100 things a day. But when you're a writer, you can actually start training yourself to use your imagination to solve problems in your plot or to come up with new character ideas. It just, takes a little bit of practice. So I remember once doing a creativity, it was like a creativity audio CD kind of book.
Right.
And in there, it teaches you, as you sort of drifting off to sleep, as you sort of meditating and letting go of all the stuff that you're dealing with during the day, like filling in tax returns or driving to the supermarket, you can actually tell yourself that, you have access to all these great minds, because you do actually, through books, through movies, through everything that they've left behind, whether it's Einstein or Fitzgerald or whoever it might be. And you can almost imagine calling them on a like a magical telephone and asking them whilst you sleep to solve a problem, whether it's with your character or with your plot. And it sounds bizarre and it sounds ridiculous, and the first few times you think this is just really silly, but you'll be surprised how often the next morning you wake up and you have a solution to the problem that you were wrestling with. So yeah, because we have absorbed all these stories, and again, to your point that you need to read widely and you need to feed your imagination and you need to feed your creativity, this is just another way to how to retrieve that information. So yeah, you just need to be aware of what you're trying to solve and what you're trying to do in your novel or your short story or your screenplay, and you can actually train your mind to come up.
And
More imagination.
To the point of the mind there, specifically you mentioned daydreaming. I think dreaming in itself is kind of, it's sort of a side effect of applying a creative process. So there's a psychological phenomena that that happens to you when you're forced to activate new parts of your brain that you don't normally use. Commonly, people in stressful situations usually talk about this. If someone's forced to go through sort of trauma counseling, or if they suddenly move to another country, they are suddenly forced to acquire a new skill set, something like that. That's usually when this happens to a person, is they become aware of their dreaming. Typically, people do usually dream every night, but normally you won't remember any of your dreams. But if you're activating these new parts of your brain during the day, then suddenly you get these intense kind of creative dreams. Not that they're particularly useful or anything like that. But if that's the side effect of what you're doing during your day, as a creative person, that's a very good sign, because it means that you're using all the information that's stored in your brain, your visual, sensory information, and just information you might have forgotten a long time ago. And you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great, but I can't move to a new country. Some of us can barely still go out of our houses at the moment, depending where you are in the world. And I don't want to go through trauma counseling. So that's a good way of provoking this response. And obviously the best way is just to pick up a new hobby, right? That's the most simple way, and something that's the opposite of what you would normally do. I mean, obviously something that still interests you. You pick up like painting or like model building or something like that. Really get into coffee or do something stimulating. I think the most effective one is probably learning a new language. That's going to be completely new information to you, and that's really going to
absolutely. And I think like activating new parts of your brain is what you said earlier. And so like stuff like art, and if you're a writer, if you start taking up drawing or something like that, that definitely does help switch off that side of you that's dealing with lockdown and all sorts of other trauma. And that's often when your creativity will come through. I mean, I saw a fascinating thing. I don't want to go into too much detail, but something on like lucid dreaming, where people actually record these lucid dreams, and they almost become like little narratives, almost like little fantastical works, which is quite amazing. I've never heard of it before.
No, and
But
I've heard of people doing it, and I think
yeah,
it's intensely personally interesting,
yeah,
but
but not for anyone else.
incredibly boring to listen to.
Yeah. And I suppose that's the difference for a writer. So one of my favorite writers, he's a writing teacher, and he was an educator, and he taught creative writing to children, is a guy called Ralph Fletcher. And he always says like there's these two universes for you to explore as a writer: the one inside, and the physical one on the outside. So that inner world is so rich, and it was something that I wanted to include in the blog on imagination, but I couldn't really find anything to back up my story, but I'm sure it's pretty true. So, a friend of mine, his father, he was a World War II buff, and he told me about these prisoners of war who they started imagining a woman in their jail cell, and they would describe her in really specific detail, and the guards couldn't obviously see this imaginary woman, but the prisoners were so vivid in their description that the guards were convinced there must be a woman there that they couldn't see, and it drove the guards crazy because they couldn't get the prisoners to stop creating this woman. And it just goes to show that our inner worlds can be just as powerful and just as real as anything, in the material world or in the physical world. And for me as a writer, that's interesting because a lot of the stuff, when we spoke about the lucid dreaming, there's a lot of the stuff that we fantasize about or that we imagine, it's interesting to us, and it excites us, and it, soothes us or whatever it does for us, but it's not necessarily something we would share in our writing or in our art because it might not make sense, or it won't have those clear constructs of a story. So that's also an interesting separation between creativity and
imagination.
And I suppose it goes back to the whole taser gun thing. It's like there was a need for that taser gun. He didn't just create it because it was some sort of arbitrary thing that he wanted to do or recreate something from his childhood. And I suppose it's the same with a screenplay or a novel. It has to be a recognizable form of entertainment that you want to share and, commoditize and make money from it. So you have to start applying different skills and craft to it is probably the main difference between the two. But for me, I guess it's not so much about understanding the difference. It's about how do you, like you said earlier, how do you use those and start using those tools as a writer? Don't you agree?
I do agree. And to think about it sort of practically is difficult, right? Because I don't think it's really a conscious effort that anyone goes through.
No.
It's 10 years of training oneself to think about things in slightly strange ways. And then suddenly it becomes easy enough to do whenever you want to.
And I don't know how easy it becomes.
Well, I mean, it becomes doable, right? People who've written dozens of books can just go at it,
No, that's
I mean,
true.
not without effort. Not without
no. I mean,
for example, the English language is probably the greatest creative work of imagination in existence today. Just, this global language, 2 billion speakers, all with this imagined set of rules that, make the thing work. But because I've been learning other languages, it just occurred to me that there's no way to spell the phonetically in English. Just to think about it, THE does not make the as a sound. Right? There's no other form of letters in the language that you can put together that make that sound. Yet it's such a fundamental part of the language. And you're only going to get that from a kind of that thought from maybe an obscure angle of someone who's interested in linguistics or something like that. So I think regardless of the thing that stokes your creativity, you're going to find something interesting to talk about. And
No, no, definitely.
From a practical point of view, I think if it's interesting to you, it will be interesting to someone else.
Oh yeah,
That's the way you have to think about it. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking, does it? It doesn't have to be like
no,
contrary to you don't have to be contrary for the sake of going against the grain, right?
no,
I
no,
mean, and that
absolutely.
can be very upsetting, I think, and a turn off to a lot of people when when a for example, if it's not creative just to go against the normal flow of a story.
No,
It's often just
unless you had a
upsetting.
very yeah, unless you had a very specific reason for doing it. Like if you wanted to create like what they call blank fiction or something that was nihilistic, or you wanted to illustrate, some sort of theory, um,
Right,
which is fine. But then it's also it has a deliberate, you know, reason for doing it, I guess.
right, and that's
Um,
the imagination process, right? You can imagine doing something awful
yeah,
like that. Yeah, I mean, a lot of literary fiction has that sort of tone where someone is just doing something because they could have imagined doing it. But
yes,
presumably,
yeah,
most people want to make an enjoyable work of fiction that people will want to read more of, right?
yes,
And
something that the reader would see themselves in,
and that
or
gives you a
identify.
limitation, and the limitation is where creativity comes into the picture,
It's
because
how. Mm.
our
And,
limitations, provide us with the tools by which we create our works. I
yeah, I
mean,
think what
a painter has to work with paint, a writer has to work with a
mm,
keyboard, a pen and pencil,
the words, yeah,
and everyone has to work with other people's brains when they think about creating art, right? Because otherwise,
yeah,
you're just doing art for yourself.
which is fine. But
It's fine,
yeah,
but if your goal is to make other people appreciate it, it's somewhat pointless.
just two things you said there, which are super interesting. Is the one is, yeah, you're great. So you could imagine, something exquisite and beautiful and in your mind, and it's in your imagination. But if you don't have the creativity or the talent to bring that across to other people, that's also a limitation. So your creativity could limit how much of your imagination you bring to life, I guess. But the other thing is that you say people could imagine doing something like that, and that's why I had some sort of really cool exercises in that imagination blog. But more than that, I wonder if imagination also doesn't feed into our sense of empathy. Like if we could imagine what it would be like to, be in a different situation in life, do or even is that a way for us to have empathy, like, or is that
So,
another concept
well, I
altogether?
mean,
Do
one
you
of
think?
my favorite writers is Robin Hobb, and she's she's a great writer, and she hardly ever writes from like a female perspective, which
I
would be,
always thought it was a
presumably her own perspective. And
she writes fantasy, right?
she
Hey?
writes fantasy, sort of medieval,
Ah, that's right. Yeah,
low sort of uh, low fantasy, I guess, in maybe a bit of like an epic kind of style. Low magic setting
yeah,
is what I meant to say, really.
yeah,
So it's basically just knights and people on horses and castles and things, but
yeah.
she usually writes from like a male perspective, but she
That's
also
interesting.
writes from like animals' perspectives. There's
Oh
always like
well, yeah,
the main character always has like a pet or something like that,
yeah,
and there's a little bit of magic. They can kind of like talk and such. So she's so good at getting into something else's head.
yeah,
You actually kind of believe that this wolf, is giving like this kind of talk to its like
yeah,
a human friend, and it's so
yeah.
believable.
I know.
And that kind of empathy must be um, must be accomplished by just thinking in depth about the motivations of people and of animals, and that is empathy, right?
Oh,
Thinking,
absolutely.
why is this happening? What is
Yeah.
the cause of this? Not, not how.
Yeah.
That's always obvious. But what is this person's motivation? I mean, that's
Yeah.
the key to understanding why they're doing
Yeah. It's,
something, and then
yeah.
replicating that in a believable way as a writer.
Yeah. No, so I think that empathy is a huge part of that imagination, especially when you see yourself playing different roles. It's always like, I think it was Picasso who said that, we're all born, every child is an artist or something like that. And the problem is, how does, remain one when you grow up? Which is true. Is like, don't grow up. Because that sense of play came to you so naturally and so authentically and so real when you were a kid. You believed every little battle you were having on the carpet with your toy soldiers. Every
Yes.
situation was so real as a child. And you need to keep that sense of believing in that make-believe world, if that makes sense, as a child,
I mean,
as a writer, or as an artist.
yes, yeah. Neil Gaiman speaks about that quite a lot, and he says
uh,
he's always tried as much as he can to never grow up mentally.
yeah. Yeah.
And he's always hung on to what that feeling of being a child, and
Yeah.
tries whenever he writes a child just to bring that kind of perspective into play. He often feels that when people write children, they just write short adults,
Yeah.
mistakenly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, talking about that's going down a side road there, but writing children characters and probably
But,
talking animals is probably very difficult to pull off as a writer. I don't think I would ever try.
but what you were saying about forgetting how to do that, or sort of believing that sort of time comes to an end, I think
Yeah.
it is a trap, right? It's the
Oh,
same with
yes.
it's the same. So people have this kind of belief that, oh, I'm 30, I'm 40 now. I can't learn a new
Yeah.
thing. I can't learn
Yeah, no.
French. It's too late. Only if I'd started when I was 10,
Yeah.
I'd be good.
Or learn to play the piano.
Or learn to play the piano. Oh no, my fingers are too clumsy now. I'll
Yeah.
never get that. But I mean, it's sort of true from the perspective that children do acquire information more quickly. But that's only because their brains are empty. you know,
Yeah.
they don't have
At
any.
that age, you're designed to pick up stuff quickly.
But also when you're a child, you don't have a job and you don't have any responsibilities, and what you can do is just sit and learn all day
Yeah.
without realizing
And
it.
play. Yeah, and play.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, supposed to be, when I was a child, I could read a book,
Yeah.
the whole day with no interruptions, and just come to the end of it and pick up a new one and start a new book.
And I think
Can't really do that
sometimes,
anymore, right?
yeah, no,
But
that's true.
that's the advantage of being a child with that sort of thing. But as an adult, I mean, you have the advantage of having a completely formed brain that's more
Mm.
logical, and you can plan and make an effort and figure out what works and what doesn't work. So you're
Mm.
advantaged in terms of logic, and you can figure out the best way of doing a thing. So if you look at your work and you can assess it scientifically, okay, well, I tried to be very creative in this point, and I tried to create a fantasy setting, and then I gave it to some friends, and they read it, and then they gave me feedback. And just to continue the analogy for a while, just to make it make more sense, is you need to choose the person you're giving it to. I mean, you're not going to give this to a person who likes romantic fiction. You want to give the fantasy book to someone who likes fantasy, right? I
That's
mean,
true.
and that's a logical choice you can make. You want to figure out from them what points you're hitting, what you're missing, what they have come to expect from that genre, and then you can self-assess and see what you did wrong. And these are all the logical sort of, I mean, they don't seem like
Mm.
creativity, right? But it is part of the creative process, is just going through what works and what doesn't, and then encouraging your brain to focus on the things that do work and letting go of all the things that don't.
And
And
that's,
that, yeah, and by doing that, then you sort of filter out all of the unnecessary things in your creative process, and eventually it becomes just a part of your habit, right? Who you are as a person.
Yeah, I would hope so. I think, yeah, the more, I think you have to make more room in your life for being creative and for using your imagination as well. You can't do that if you're stressed and busy all the time. And I think that's
Yes, yeah,
probably
and
one of the
yeah,
challenges.
that is a problem
Mm,
in not having enough time.
yeah, especially as
You
a
do
grown
have
up.
to just assess that, how much time do I have for a thing?
Yeah. Um,
How much time do you think you need to be creative, Anthony? That's a good question.
I think it's very different for every person, but when we used to do writers right, in class, with students and delegates, I always used to say, let's just try and find that little patch of creativity. Maybe you can't find every day, but maybe every Saturday morning you could, find an hour or two. I don't think, for me, 2 hours, 2 or 3 hours a day would be the dream, I guess.
The dream, yeah.
Which is not, yeah, to write and to be creative or to draw.
So,
But yeah,
yeah,
you just have
yeah.
to find what works for you, I guess. It's difficult. It's a difficult one to answer.
So
But the more regular,
presumably, you need to have some time to not think about normal things in your life, right? So
yeah,
it sounds strange, but
some of it,
you're gonna need to have some thinking time, right?
yeah,
To get the imagination
yeah,
in order to have your creative process happen.
yeah.
So,
I
I
think
mean, you can't be thinking about work during that time, for instance.
no, no, and it's
Can't be
very
thinking
difficult to
about
switch.
chores
Mm,
or cleaning or anything that you might otherwise need to do.
yeah,
So
so that's why I think
maybe, yeah,
that's why I think it's important to do something that's not sometimes. I think there's two parts to it. One is that part of the muse and just showing up. So like if you have to be at your desk, from 7 to 8 at night, yeah, you will start being creative because you've taught yourself to show up and then be creative. The other part is like what you said earlier about being in the shower on the treadmill is sometimes when you switch off that part of the brain, that's when you get answers, like if you bored. So boredom is a great tool for a writer or for any artist.
no,
I mean, if you
that's exactly where I was going
think
with
back
that.
to your kid when you were bored as a kid, that's when you started making up all these insane little stories, and that's when your beach towel became a cape, and you were now Superman, and you entertained yourself. So boredom, I think people underestimate how great boredom can be for an artist. But yeah, sometimes even if you're just sweeping or you're running, that's when you think like, oh, maybe if I made, my antagonist the brother of my hero instead of a stranger, that will work. And it's like, yeah, because you're not too focused on it. Sometimes you have to, focus on a problem, but then let it go, and do something else. And then your imagination actually gets to work on it in the background. So like what I said earlier about asking for help before you go to sleep. And whilst you're sleeping, your subconscious will try and solve some of those issues for you. I don't know if that
So
makes sense.
it does. Um, I just, I've got an example of someone who uh, they didn't become a writer, so maybe it's not
A
entirely,
great example.
but they became a storyteller. They make
Yeah.
animated videos, right?
Oh wow, that's amazing.
So I mean they're doing something creative. But this person set
Yeah.
out with the intent to become a writer, and
Yes.
he very much he made a schedule, um,
Yeah.
a schedule to consume things that would uh, be the genre he wanted to write in, right?
Okay.
So I think he wanted to make fantasy writing. I presume. I'm not sure. But so he would set aside and okay, this 3 hours a day I need to read. Right, I need to read these books. They're the core books of the kind of genre I want to write in. So I need to know these things. And then he would go on a walk for an hour, where he would listen to music with no words. So he would just be able to think about whatever. And during that time, he would think about what he was gonna write. And then he would, come back and then just for, I think, I mean, he had quite a little bit of time on his hands, but like 3 or 4 hours a day, he would just then write. And he produced 4 books a year for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Eventually came to the conclusion that, to be an animator and tell his stories that way. But I mean, that was incredibly effective for him.
Yeah.
Not everyone has that much time, obviously.
Yeah, or has such a clear method to getting to the creativity. I think for most of us, it happens in a weird, clumsy, messy, mysterious way.
I think that's true, but there must be some way of provoking it. Is my thought, right?
Yeah, to show up sometimes is the best way. Just to, there are ways you can trick yourself.
Yeah, so just quickly, and then I'll let you speak, Anthony.
No, it's fine.
Another thought I have is a lot of people are just too tired to be creative.
Yeah, no.
I mean, their job drains them of physical energy, and then they just don't have the willpower to be creative. And
a lot of people are creative during the day. That's their job as well.
Yes, I mean, you might be a copywriter for a magazine and have to think of new things all the time. Or you might be drawing, editing videos. I don't know. Any job I can conceive of probably has something to do with writing, but so I'm very bad at thinking about what people do. Presumably, people who do something physical might have a bit of a benefit.
As long as
it's not exhausting. Maybe if you're a barista or something, you probably have a lot of time to think about your screenplay, right?
Yeah, sounds about right.
So I mean, that could be a very positive thing if you have so much time to think about things, provided then you go and you spend some time actually writing them down afterwards.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's ways you can trick yourself that might work for you. So whether that's using different color pens or something like that. I always remember Patricia Highsmith, who wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley. I think she worked for a comic book company when she was younger, also like who did comic strips. It's sort of quite a creative job. And then when she would go home at night to work on her own stories and her own novel, she would have a bath and she would dress up in completely different clothes so that there was this kind of like, shift between day job, night job, and that's how she tricked her brain into doing that, when you're talking about your friend who became an animator as well, I also one of a student who wanted to become a novelist, and eventually she started a very successful PR company, but wasn't a novel writing company. You know what I mean? And then she wasn't happy that. And then I met up with her a couple of years ago, and she'd opened a shop, and you could just see how all that creativity went into the shop. There were beautiful murals on the wall where she got local artists to come and draw these murals. The shop was beautifully designed. There was like a caravan where you could go buy, coffee and stuff like that. So she found an outlet for that creativity and for her imagination. But, probably that journey showed her that she didn't want to really be a novelist. Do you know what I mean? And that's fine as well. Maybe you want to own a beautiful emporium, or you want to animate, or you just, want to spend more time living your life more creatively through travel or for other experiences.
And want to, not everyone is going to be a novel writer, a novelist. And
that's fine as well.
But, time spent creating something is not time wasted. You will never regret writing a novel that no one ever reads.
Yeah, no, the only competition is with yourself, the only limits are your creativity and your imagination.
Yeah, it's somewhat the same with like getting a degree or something. It's largely a meaningless thing to everyone else in the world. but I bet you don't feel
Yeah.
like it was a waste of time.
No, let's hope not.
So not,
But
yeah.
another thing is that you're talking about that fantasy author Robin. Is it Robin?
Robin
What's
Hobb,
her
yeah.
name again? Hobb. I
Her
think it's a
real
good.
name's
Get
Helen
it inside.
Lindholm, but yeah, Robin Hobb is her pen name.
Okay. So some people might have that imagination where it takes them to, talking animals and castles and that sort of thing. Other people, their imagination or their escapist fiction is like, what would it be like to be a star in Hollywood, or
Yes, yeah.
what would it be like to open a fabulous shop, or, to fall in love with a handsome man. And that's fine, because those concepts are sort of grounded in reality, but they're no less fantastical, if that makes sense, so your imagination doesn't always have to be something fantasy based, or it could just be what would be if you lived another life, or in another century, or you followed a different career.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I'm kind of interested in like weird love stories at the moment. Like the weirder the way that people meet in a love story, I think the better the love story tends to be. Is my conclusion.
There's a challenge for the writers out there.
Yes, yeah. Find the weirdest start to a relationship you can, and then it doesn't matter how poorly you put together the rest of that story. Almost, just use the stock standard formula after that, and it's still going to be interesting.
Yeah, it could be, instead of the cute meat, it can be the weird meat, or the meat weird, not the meat cute, as they do in rom-coms. I think that's a challenge
one
for
thing
the
at the
writers
moment where like these people, like after like 30 minutes of meeting each other, they go to like a marriage registration office, get married, right? And then they introduce themselves with their proper names and such things. It's a weird story, but it's intensely interesting. So yes, I mean, just the thought of it's such a creative thing to do. Just reversing
maybe that's
the order of things in a mundane story.
Exactly. But now that you said it, I know this is also like a complete down the rabbit hole, is that finding ways for your characters to meet, if they're in a romantic relationship, is very difficult. Because there's only sort of so many ways. It's like, oh my goodness, did they meet at work? Did they meet at a nightclub? So I quite like your suggestion. I think I'm going to set myself a kind of challenge.
Yeah.
But one of the other things that you can do as a writer, and I think I do sort of touch on it in the blog, is that if you want to play with your imagination as a writer, one of the exercises you can do doesn't involve writing. You actually just sit somewhere and you close your eyes and you imagine a scenario, whether it's, a party that your main character is going to, or if you thinking what it would be like to be an architect, and you just try and make it as vivid in your mind without writing anything down. Like it can be for 20 minutes or half an hour. And yeah, sure, when it's finished, maybe you want to sit down and write it as a scene, or maybe you think, okay, well, that wasn't a great session. But the more you practice, trust me, the more you can do. I mean, you can create whole families, whole houses, and yeah, just in your mind without sharing that. So,
like the past, I don't know, 20 years, I've had an idea for a story. And I've just kept thinking about it. And I don't know if I'm going to write it, but I mean, I kind of wrote down like the plot points when I was like 15. And I went in, I kind of looked at it, right? And I wrote a little thing about each character. And I've just kind of kept thinking about it every now and then.
Yeah.
And it was so straightforward when I was a teenager. And it became incredibly complicated when I was in my 20s.
As it does.
And now I think I want it to be like more mundane.
More straightforward. Back to the...
Maybe not more straightforward. Just I want more detail about everything.
Yeah.
I think I just, now that I know more things, I want things to be more detailed. But I also don't want it to be boring. So that's my creative challenge, I think, with regards to my writing, is that I need to be creative in a way that is detailed but not boring.
Yeah. Yes, because
and it's something I couldn't have done without just knowing a lot more things when I was much younger.
Yeah. And obviously you would write that story a little bit differently or very differently now as an adult to how you would have written it as a teen. But of course, I think maybe, I don't know if it's for you, but sometimes you have this image or the story sits in your imagination and it's so perfect and it's so beautiful that you're almost terrified to put it on the page because it's not going to be as perfect as it was in your head. And that can be quite paralyzing. But yeah, if you think the story is good and you want to share it, you actually kind of have to get over that as well.
No, that's
I don't know
true,
if that's
right?
the case for you.
No, I think it is true, because I think everyone has that idea that they think is just perfect. And it's usually like a kind of like idealized version of themselves doing something. You know, that's your first story that you ever want to tell. And I just think as you get older, you start to appreciate how things are not perfect. And sometimes that's better. You know. That's the interesting part of a story is, you know, how wrong it is, or how, you know, weird a character is, or something like that.
Yeah. And a lot of great stories are being told in a very sort of clumsy way. You know, some of my favorite authors are they're not the best writers, you know. I mean, even what was his name? I remember Dorothy Parker wrote like a little satirical verse about him. It's like Theodore Dreiser, who wrote an American Tragedy. She was like, he ought to write nicer, you know? But his stories are like just so powerful that you know, it doesn't really matter how they're written. But I know that I have like a few stories that are like in my head that I'm really terrified to put down on the page because they're so vague and perfect in my head that to try and give them the plot in that would just feel like, I don't know, it would feel wrong.
So Anthony,
you know, maybe they need to live there a bit longer. Maybe they need to live in my imagination a bit longer until they're ready. Who knows?
I sometimes think that you need to be like a certain age before you write something, which I think
maybe
can discourage people who are a bit younger. But it really shouldn't. I mean, they should be writing, and if they want to write,
I wouldn't wait too long. I mean,
but you know, like sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, I was just saying, I met a young writer. They were like about 12 or 13, and their writing was perfect. It was like brilliant writing, but yeah, they hadn't really had enough of that life
been
experience.
Beaten down by life enough for it to have enough flavor in it.
You know, it was really good mimicking of some great other writers. You know, so yeah, I do think you need a bit of life experience. But on the other side of that, Chris, I would say don't wait too long.
Yes.
You know, start writing, even if it's for yourself. And you know, start creating a journal. Start writing stories. You know, stories. You know, it's fine if life gets in the way.
It just occurs to me that the creativity that a younger person tends to produce, is often like this dark and edgy kind of creativity.
You know, like the torture,
your Twilight kind of novels, right?
yeah.
And then a somewhat older person often has a much brighter work of creativity that comes out of them. I'm just thinking, you know, like the Hobbit. I mean, written by you know Tolkien. You know, sort of speaking to his grandchildren as he was writing it, right? Inventing an optimistic journey for them. I mean, even the Lord of the Rings, although much darker in tone, is ultimately a super optimistic work, even though you know, it's about war and death and all that sort of thing. I just wonder if inevitably that's the kind of natural process that you need to come to some sort of balance in that sort of mindset in
Yeah.
order to create something that's truly interesting. And it's not necessarily about age, obviously. I think it's just about
No, I think
having enough information that you can draw from enough sources to create something convincing.
for a lot of us that is the case. You go through that angsty kind of teenage stuff. But I suppose some other writers you'll often see, and I can't think of an example now, but some writers will replay a trauma. It's obviously quite a personal trauma, and they will replay that in their fiction or in their work all the time, and they'll just find new ways of resolving it. Doesn't necessarily always get lighter. I'm just trying to think of somebody who'd be doing that. Yes, I mean, even I'm just going to use a random example, but even somebody like Hitchcock. So Hitchcock apparently had quite a phobia of this irrational phobia about being guilty for something that he hadn't done, and it stemmed from like a childhood prank that his parents played on him, where they sent him to the police station because he was naughty or something. But you can see in all his movies how he plays out that irrationality and that fear of getting caught or trying to evade capture. It's a very powerful theme in all his stories, not necessarily in a dark way,
Yeah.
But I also think, sometimes you think the stuff that you write when you're younger is so brilliant, but then when you read it when you're older, you think she wasn't that great to begin with.
Shallow.
But it's too So that's why I say don't wait too long to get published or to get writing, because once it's out there, it's too late to take it back. And I think that's part of being a writer, is that you're not going to be able to put perfect work out there all the time.
I suppose
I don't know if
just to give people, it's not to give people the impression that we're saying you can't do anything to force the process of creativity. You certainly can.
No, you absolutely can.
Japanese publishing companies literally lock their authors in rooms
and
set a deadline for them, and they produce pretty good content on a regular basis, a lot more often than Western writers. It's actually Douglas Adams was forced to finish The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. His publisher was like, well, it's 3 months overdue, we're just going to buy you a hotel room and it better be done by Friday. One of the best books of all time.
The deadlines are a great way to inspire your imagination and creativity. I know there were some Hollywood directors used to lock their writers in rooms with peanuts and bananas just so that they could finish scripts for the next day's filming, But I think too much stress also, can damage your creativity. So,
for sure. Okay.
And I think trying to write to those kind of,
you do balance is important. You can force it.
I think
if you really need to.
You can't force it. You have to coax it out and you give it free rein to play around a bit, your creativity. So, leave yourself enough time. But I think, create like a little safe creative place for you to play in every day or every week at least, And whether that's journaling and then writing a couple of pages or trying to draw a scene, there's a million ways you can, whatever works for you. Some people like to play the piano just to clear their mind. Some people, like to go for a brisk walk like your friend. You just have to find something that gets you in that creative mood.
Which once you're in is amazing. In a room with nothing to occupy his mind. He doesn't bring his cell phone with him. He doesn't have a computer or a television or a radio. He just has a desk and some pens. And he says, eventually, the boredom from doing nothing makes writing the most preferable thing in the world to do. That's a very gentle way of forcing yourself to be creative.
Some people have extreme methods. I mean, I think I read somewhere that Jonathan Franzen, who wrote The Corrections and Freedom, he puts on earphones, he even blindfolds himself, and he has, he just writes in like a complete sensory deprivation. And I think that's where your idiosyncrasies and your weird habits and stuff as a writer people will absolutely forgive that. I don't think you'll forgive that in your accountant or your tax person, but in a writer, it seems quite normal.
The weirder the writer, the better the book. That's just how it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Often you won't want to sit next to your favorite authors in a room, but they produce wonderful books. And I think on that,
I think some of the most.
Sorry, Anthony. I think we've talked quite long, and hopefully this has been productive for our listeners. So I'd like to thank you for being with us, Anthony.
It's been fun. Yeah, no, it's been fun, and I think some of the most productive, most creative ways is trying to avoid writing. I mean, if we could bottle that, we'd make a fortune.
That is true.
Yeah, no, it's been fun, Chris. I don't know if it was any
no, it was
value, but it was a good conversation, and maybe it got people thinking about creativity a little bit differently, or made them think about how they could capture that imagination of their childhood again. Yeah, so if we've done that, then I think we've done a great job.
Thanks for being with us today, Anthony. You can find Anthony's articles on writing.The. I've been Christopher Dean. You can find me at Christopher.Dean at Twitter, and also on writerswrite.co.za. Thank you all for listening.